Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us here. My name is Christopher Swanson. I'm the Vice President of Editorial Projects and Education, which of course is better known as a nonprofit organization that publishes Education Week. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the official release of Diplomas Count 2011 on behalf of our President, Ginny Edwards, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, as well as a number of my colleagues from the Education Week newsroom, the EPE Research Center, and elsewhere at EPE, and you'll see many of those folks around the room here today. That greeting extends both to those of us gathered here in Washington, D.C., as well as those who are following us online via the webcast on edweek.org, and so welcome everyone. Today, we're marking the release of the 6th edition of our annual special report devoted to high school graduation and high school reform. Every year, the report digs into a really critical or emerging issue that's on the nation's high school and college readiness agenda. This year, the report is titled Beyond High School Before Baccalaureate, Meaningful Alternatives to a Four-Year Degree. As the title suggests, this year we're examining the important space between a high school diploma and a four-year college degree. Sometimes this is referred to as the forgotten third, and these individuals have too long been left out of the national dialogue, both within education and within economic circles, until recently, that is. In just the past 6 months or so, we've witnessed a great resurgence of attention to this critical sub-baccalaureate population, as we call them in the report. Not only do the ranks of these some college but less than a four-year degree folks make up a of the U.S. population, and many people recognize, well above 50 million Americans. They've also become a focal point in our national priorities to dramatically raise levels of college completion. So we'll be hearing much more about these issues today as the day goes on, and we'll also share highlights from our latest analysis of high school graduation rates. But first, I have the pleasure to extend a few thank yous and make an introduction. So this year's Diplomas Count report was made possible by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Michelle Cahill, Vice President of National Programs at Carnegie, has joined us here today, and we'll be hearing some remarks from her this afternoon. The Mott Foundation sends us greetings. Unfortunately, they were unable to be here today. They're right in the middle of their big annual board meeting. Otherwise, they would have been here in an instant. So we appreciate the involvement of these two philanthropic partners, and they've both been longtime supporters of education. To support production of today's event, we have support from the Lumina Foundation for Education. As many, if not all of you here in the room know, Lumina is the largest national private foundation committed solely to enrolling and graduating more students from college. We're also excited to announce that the Lumina Foundation will be underwriting a line of coverage in Education Week over the next 2 years, where we'll be examining efforts to better align college readiness initiatives across the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels. So we're very glad that Lumina's president, Jamie Narasotis, is willing to join us here today, and who's going to offer some thoughts to kick off today's discussion. So here's the introduction. Since 2008, Jamie has been the president of the Lumina Foundation, where he's been instrumental in setting and pursuing the foundation's ambitious goals. In particular, its goal to increase the percentage of Americans with high-quality degrees and credentials to 60% by the year 2025. Before taking the helm at Lumina, Jamie had already earned a national reputation for his decades of work in education. Widely recognized as one of the leading lights in the higher ed world, Jamie founded and for 15 years led the Institute for Higher Education Policy, also known as IHEP or ICAP in our Washington, D.C. alphabet soup speak. So suffice it to say that Jamie's accomplishments are too numerous to mention here today, so I won't even try it. But please join me in welcoming Jamie Narasotis to kick things off.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. Really delighted to have the opportunity to offer just a few brief remarks at this important event. And I say an important event. Chris mentioned I have the perhaps dubious distinction of having spent much of my professional career in Washington before I joined the foundation in 2008. So I describe myself as a policy person masquerading as a philanthropy leader in my current role. And I have to say that this Diplomas Count 2011 and the conversation we're going to have here today is something that I recognize and acknowledge is terribly important in terms of the kinds of dialogue and discussions that need to take place for us to improve educational effectiveness in our nation. So we're very pleased to be partnering with Editorial Projects in Education Week on this important event, because we think that the nation's economic and social future is very closely tied to the success of our nation's students. I think the work that we're talking about here today at this event is also critically important because, as Chris mentioned, from Lumina's standpoint, all of our efforts, all of our resources are being devoted to dramatically increasing the proportion of Americans with high-quality degrees and credentials to 60% from the current level of less than 40% in just a very short period of time. The Lumina Foundation's efforts are exclusively focused on college access and success, but that doesn't mean that our work at Lumina starts with the work in college. That is, post-secondary attainment doesn't begin with the first year of college. In fact, it starts much earlier. For all of our history of the foundation for more than a decade, we focus both on the access and success efforts in higher education. Increasing access to higher education obviously needs to increase many years before those college applications are actually being filled out. We know, and I think all of you know, that what's really needed is system-level change, really along the entire continuum of education in this country, from pre-K through post-secondary education, and our emerging relationships with Education Week and Editorial Projects in Education is something that we think is an important part of our work to bridge the K-12 and higher education or post-secondary education levels over the course of the next few years. In our view, there's an unbroken string that connects preparation for college and success in college. And we think that that connection needs both close and more constant attention. We hold a long time and ongoing commitment at Lumina Foundation to increasing the number of students who are truly ready for college, whether they're traditional age recent high school graduates or members of the increasingly diverse population of 21st century students, older adults, displaced workers, part-time students, first-generation students, and of course the growing proportion of minority students, really the emerging majority in our country. We know that the college doors will have to be open to many more of these students of every type of description if we're to reach that goal 2025. So increasing our college-ready population will have to be important for our nation for both its economic well-being as well as its social well-being across the continuum of education. That is, that we need to be thinking about not only getting these students college ready, but also seeing them being successful at whatever credential they might achieve at the post-secondary level. So that's why we think that this report, this year, Diplomas Count 2011, is so important in terms of our efforts at Lumina Foundation. If you look simply at the benefits of higher education and the important role that higher education plays in our economic and social well-being, you know, of course, 2/3 of the jobs being created in this country now require some level of education beyond high school. That's a huge increase since the mid-1970s, from less than 30% of jobs requiring any education beyond high school. But more importantly, perhaps even than jobs, is that we recognize that the economic and social benefits that come from individuals who have post-secondary degrees and credentials are immense. That is, the benefits of increasing educational attainment are linked to higher levels of social and civic involvement, lower crime rates, less use of social welfare programs, etc. In short, that post-secondary success contributes directly to our collective health and well-being as a society, which is why we think, perhaps copy the title of the report, diplomas really do count. This version of Diplomas Count that we're talking about today, the 2011 edition, happens to focus on what happens to students who are not getting a baccalaureate degree. That is, students who are achieving sub-baccalaureate credentials. And I want to say a special thank you to Education Week for their efforts in terms of focusing on that population. which we think is long overdue. We think that the important role of baccalaureate degrees in this country has been well articulated for our nation, but the important ways in which the sub-baccalaureate credentials play a critical role in economic and social well-being has been underappreciated and perhaps in many ways misunderstood. So thinking about how we can increase the focus on students seeing all types of credentials post-high school as being a part of their future is an important part of our work at Lumen Foundation, and this edition of Diplomas Count we think helps to point the way. A lot of important questions, I think, result from the work that Education Week has engaged and has embarked on with this 2011 Diplomas Count. For example, how can we ensure that students truly are college ready? In other words, how can we better align what we now see as the growing effort to define standards and assessments at the K-12 level with what we do in higher education? That alignment of assessment and standards between K-12 and higher education is something that's going to require increasing focus. How can we get a more accurate and useful picture of the meaning and value of these sub-baccalaureate credentials and degrees? How many, how do employers actually view associate degrees, for example? How many employers in the current context actually see associate degrees as valuable in terms of their workforce? Are occupational certificates valued? Which ones, how much are they valued in the context? What's gained, and perhaps in some cases what might be lost, from effort to accelerate progress to these baccalaureate credentials, something that we've actually invested in Lumen Foundation as an important part of our work to reduce the time that it takes to get a credential, to get people back into the workforce, to become productive members of our society. And can we forge a more effective system to give returning students, particularly returning adult students, some level of credit, academic credit, for their work experience, for their prior learning that they may have done? That's an emerging area of work that I think results from what we see in Diplomas Count 2011. So all of these questions, I think, and many more, that you could probably think of quite easily, relate directly to an issue that's hugely important to our work at the Lumen Foundation, and that is ensuring the ultimate quality of the educational experience. As we ramp up degree and certificate attainment for our country and try to get to that 2025 goal of 60%, it will be highly important for us to ensure that these newly minted credentials are truly valuable, that they reflect learning that's both rigorous and relevant. In short, and a sort of summary from my remarks this morning, we need to continue to make sure that these diplomas truly do count. And that's why we're so incredibly impressed with the work that EP has done here, and why we're so happy to be involved in the work going forward, as well as in this event today. So thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to being a part of this discussion today. Congratulations again to Education Week for their important work on Diplomas Count 2011. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm going to try to walk and talk through this stand and talk today. I think Jamie did a wonderful job of really setting the stage and highlighting the importance of what we're doing at this report this year. Important from a journalistic perspective in particular. The importance of the wide array of pathways into and through post-secondary education, specifically those that do not necessarily end with a 4-year degree, at least not immediately. And so we've seen a lot of talk in the past 3, 4, 5 years about college readiness as a big national priority. And the quote we have up here is from the State of the Union address in 2009, where the President and the administration really set this at the front of the education agenda. I think we have a tendency sometimes in education when we talk about college readiness to think first and foremost about 4-year college and 4-year degrees. But when we get a little bit into the discussion, even in the State of the Union, we do have an appreciation for the importance of a wider variety of educational outcomes, community colleges, technical training programs, and so forth. And And we see these types of goals and priorities articulated and expressed in a variety of different ways. If we look at the ESEA blueprint, for example, the administration's blueprint for the authorization of the broadest elementary secondary education law in the country, this goal of college completion is the first education goal listed in the blueprint for ESEA, and the E and the S for elementary secondary. And so I think we see the real importance of better aligning our system from kindergarten and pre-kindergarten all the way through higher education. The Lumina Foundation has, I think, one of the most ambitious and clearest goals in each regard. We've already heard ahead of goal 2025. And again, we're not just talking about a four-year college goal here, especially if we really want to raise overall levels of college completion so dramatically, so quickly. It can't just be that simple. So at the same time that we set these ambitious post-secondary goals, we're also continuing to struggle and work through some of our challenges at the high school level. We have some good news to report this year on the graduation rate, but still, we're failing to graduate about 1.2 million public high school students every year in their diploma. Communities across the nation have continued to struggle with this issue. It's not just in a few places, although it is a very concentrated issue where we have a disproportionately small number of particularly large districts contributing a disproportionate share of the nation's dropouts. So that's a big challenge that we continue to struggle with. But again, there's some good news here. In this year's report, we're focusing on that forgotten third, right? This space between a high school diploma and a four-year college degree. There's a number of different pathways, and I think more and more we're concerned with the viability of those pathways, both from an educational perspective, as an educational destination, as well as to the extent that they can offer a stepping stone into further education at the four-year college level, and the different types of training that are received, and the connection to the economy. One of the big sparks to this particular report was, as we'll hear a little bit later, the report from Harvard back in the winter, Pathways to Prosperity, that really put this college for all debate back on the national agenda. And so you'll see that theme woven in and out of the journalism in this year's report, as well as a number of ways we try to look at pathways in action, into higher education. You can see some great examples of what we have there. There's linked learning, new age career technical education with really strong academic foundations at the high school level, early college, the important role of community colleges. And there's a little bit on the for-profit institutions that we've heard a lot about in the past year in particular. So these are all really important. I think the key issue to keep in mind here is we're focusing on multiple and meaningful pathways into higher education. What I'm actually going to spend the most of the time talking about this morning is the research in this year's report. As always, Diplomas Count is the place where we release our annual update of our graduation analysis for the country. This is an independent analysis we do every year, and we have data everywhere from the nation to the states to local school districts. We try to do a special research study every year, if we can, related to the special theme. And this year's, we're taking our own cut at this economic dimension of the issue, in particular, the economic benefits and other aspects of this sub-baccalaureate population. And we also do our annual update of state policies related to graduation rates. Okay, so the nation turns a corner. Here comes the good news after the methodology. So the folks who have read this report probably know this already. We do our own analysis of graduation rates. It's independent. It's different than what the states themselves produce in most cases. We use a common data source, the Federal Common Core of Data. We use a single calculation method, the Cumulative Promotion Index. We put those together, and what that allows us to do is provide comparable apples-to-apples data for every school district in the country and do comparisons everywhere from the district to the state to the national level and everywhere in between. The comparability of the data and the fact that we can do this in a comprehensive national perspective is extremely important for the work we do. There are always strengths and limitations to any type of research. This is not magic. If folks have questions about that, I love nothing more than to talk about methodology, so keep those in mind for the Q&A. But here's the good news. So for the class of 2008, which is the most recent year for which we have data, the national graduation rate rose to 71.7%, just a hair below 72%. This is a significant increase over the prior year, and is also a big turnaround after 2 consecutive years of national stagnation and declines. So for a couple of years, we've been really concerned about where we were seeing the trajectory go, and I think what we're seeing now is the hard work that folks have been doing for the better part of a decade really starting to take hold. We're seeing it at this national level. It's very widespread. The majority of states increased this past year, and we're seeing this increase for all major demographic groups that we can look at. Longer term perspective, we see the graduation rate there placed in the context of the graduation and high school completion from the 1870s. We're not at the historical peak, which came in the late 60s, early 70s, but we're at the highest point now than we've been since the late 1980s, so for more than 2 decades. So this is definitely news. Taking a little bit more narrow view of the past 10 years and kind of breaking the trends down for major racial and ethnic groups, we see here again that there's significant disparities between different student populations. You know, if we looked at poverty, we would see the same sort of thing. But we have whites and Asians here graduating at significantly higher levels than the average student, and in particular, much higher than historically disadvantaged minority groups, Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans, who graduate, in the low to mid 50%. So one of the things when you kind of unpack this a little bit, you'll see that all of these groups are rising. The graduation rates are going up. African Americans and whites are seeing the fastest increases, and so as a result, the black-white achievement gap is narrowing over this period of time. But the gaps between whites and Latinos and Native Americans are actually widening a little bit because whites are improving faster. So that's a good news, bad news story. So I think we're seeing some definite signs of improvement, but again, we are having these historical disparities. Again, to mention that 1.2 million dropouts figure, yeah, that amounts to 6,400 students lost every day of the school year in our nation's public schools, or 1 student every 27 seconds. So while we're seeing some improvement, there are still far too many students who are failing to finish high school with a diploma. We mentioned kind of the racial disparities that we've seen historically, and these are the same types of gaps that we see in other educational outcomes, whether it's graduation rates or tested achievement. Historically disadvantaged minority groups graduate at lower levels. Males graduate at lower levels in general. We've got about a 7 percentage point gender gap in our latest analysis. Females graduate at higher levels, and this has remained virtually unchanged as long as we've been doing this analysis, so that's very persistent as well. But minority males graduate at especially low levels, in some cases right around, or a little above or a little below 50%. For African American males, the chance of graduating from high school with a diploma is exactly 50%, so it's the flip of a coin for that group of students. If you follow Diplomas Count and some of our other work in recent years, you've seen kind of maps like this before of various kinds. This is a graduation rate of every school district in the country. Blue is higher, orange is lower here. And you'll see the kind of regional patterning that you see a lot in education. Performance levels tend to be lower in the southeast and into parts of the west, higher in the Midwest and parts of the northeast. If you're interested in really local data, we've got data for every school district in the country available on our mapping website, which is EdWeek Maps, and you can see the URL there if you've got really good eyes, and if you don't, it's maps.edweek.org. And that's just been freshly updated with this year's data. When you kind of break it down by state, you see kind of the results of that geographical patterning we were just looking at. State graduation rates vary tremendously around that 72% national average. In the highest performing states, graduation rates are above 80%. And you can see who those states are there. New Jersey, Vermont, Wisconsin, North Dakota. The lowest performing states have graduation rates at or below 60%. And in some cases, far lower than 60%. So if you're a student in the District of Columbia or Nevada, your chances of graduating from high school with a diploma are about half of those of a student in New Jersey. So it really matters tremendously where you live. One of the things that you couldn't see in that map before was the urban areas where so many of our students go to school, because they're geographically little areas. They don't pop out of a big map like that. But we did an analysis where we looked at the number of dropouts produced by each school district in the country, and then we ranked them by the districts that produced the most dropouts. And what we found is that this is a very concentrated issue at a certain level. There's 25 individual school districts, and you can see those listed there in the country, out of about 11,000 that graduate high school students. Those 25 districts produce 1/5 of the nation's dropouts. 1 out of every 5 dropouts nationwide in just these 25 districts. So that's a severely concentrated problem at a certain level. But the flip side of that is we have 2 dozen or so high priority targets here that if we could really get some leverage on just these 25 districts, we could actually raise the national graduation rate noticeably with just those districts. Okay, so some of that was a little negative. I want to end the discussion of the graduation rate here on a positive note. Again, a reminder, the graduation rate for the class of 2008 increased a lot by national standards, more than 2 percentage points. It's a broad-based improvement. We're seeing this across groups in the large majority of states. I think what we're seeing here is, we're starting to kind of reap the fruit of these really intensive efforts we've had over the years on dropout prevention and high school reform. The roots of these problems are very deep, they're very persistent, and it just takes some time to be able to see the results that we want to see, and I think we're starting to see those now. The question, of course, now is that we've started to see these improvements. Are we going to continue to see these improvements? Can we sustain them? And we'll be, of course, keeping a close eye on that next year. So to turn the topic just for a couple minutes here to the economic perspective, and in particular, the role of sub-baccalaureate education. So I think there's one of the nice things about all the research that's been done in the last years, there's a lot more information about the economic returns to particular levels and types of education, and that comes from all different sorts of places. We wanted to take our own fresh look at these issues, really specifically focused on the theme of this year's report. And so we went to one of our go-to data sources, which is the American Community Survey. We've got data from 2009. If you're familiar with the ACS, this is a very big annual survey done by the census. It's got 3 million people in it every year, and it's replacing the long form of the census. So it's got long form census type of information, education, kind of economic and workforce participation, and so forth. It's a great data source. And you can also, we're just going to get a little bit of a national taste for the patterns here, but you can actually get very local. You can go within state level with the ACS as well. So a couple just basic touch points here. This sub-baccalaureate population is a lot bigger than I think many people, even who work within education, realize. When you look at the segment of the population who has more than a high school education but less than a 4-year college degree, that accounts for about 31% of the prime working age population, so 25 to 54. That's, at least when cut this way, it's the largest single education block in the workforce. We've got about 1/4 of the population has just a high school diploma, about 30% with a BA or higher graduate professional degree, and 13% with less than a high school education. When we break out that 31% of the workforce that's got the sub-baccalaureate level of education, 28% of those folks have an associate's degree in particular, and the other 72% have some other amount of post-secondary education, but no degree. One of the things I think we're always interested in is better understanding the economic and other implications of different levels of education. We're going to look at earnings here. We could have looked at any number of different educational or economic or even social outcomes, and we'd see probably some very similar pattern. When we break down annual earnings by education level, we see that sub-baccalaureate individuals earn just about $30,000 a year. That's right at about the national median level for prime working age adults. That offers about an $8,000 a year bump over just finishing high school, and so that's a substantial increase given the kind of levels of earnings we're talking about here. But it's important at least to acknowledge kind of the extremes here, because that's an important part of the context. If you fail to finish high school, you're going to earn on average about $12,000 a year. And that's no kind of salary to build a life on, much less help to support a family. And so I think the fact that we've clearly moved past the age where anybody can have reasonable confidence of stability in life if they at least don't finish high school. At the other extreme, though, we have BA, graduate professional degrees. Again, that's a big group. And they earn, on average, about $50,000 a year. So that, of course, offers a big increase above sub-baccalaureate degree or level of education. The important thing here, when we look at average levels, the thing we can sometimes miss is that there's a great overlap across these different groups. You can see the dark bell curve there is sub-baccalaureate, the lighter blue is a four-year degree, and the orange is high school or less. The key thing to take away here is about 22% of all the sub-baccalaureate, or more than a quarter of the associate's degree holders, have annual incomes at least as high as the median for a BA degree, so that's about $50,000 a year. The last thing we looked at here with the economic analysis was kind of the occupational profile. And so the ACS, tells you what occupation all the respondents are in, and that allowed us to do something interesting. So we looked at the educational levels of people who hold different types of jobs. And there's actually, a wide variety of educational backgrounds of people in most occupations. But we found 50 occupations where at least half of all the workers had the sub-baccalaureate level of education. You can see the earnings levels of those right there, and the full list of what those occupations are is in the full report. But they run the gamut. You have at the higher end some of these occupations earning above $70,000 a year. At the lower end, you have massage therapists at about $18,000 a year. So again, a tremendous range, but the majority of these occupations, pay salaries at or sometimes substantially above the median for this level of education. The dark group is occupations that are at least $50,000 a year. So that's going to kind of wrap up this portion of the discussion. I'm going to turn things over to Amy, who's going to quickly walk us through the State of the States update, our policy update.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to be sharing some highlights of our annual policy survey and our review of how states are calculating graduation rates under stricter federal regulations. So each year for Diplomas Count, the EPE Research Center surveys all 50 states in the District of Columbia in order to track policy activity in three broad areas. We look at college and work readiness definitions, at high school completion credentials, and at high school exit exams. This year, we found that 33 states now spell out what college-ready students should know and be able to do to succeed in entry-level college courses. That's 10 additional states from this time last year and 22 additional states from when we first started tracking this indicator in 2007. This increase likely reflects the convergence of a bunch of factors, including increasing emphasis on readiness in national policy forums, the accelerating influence of Common Core standards, and the culmination of pre-existing state-led efforts. The most common approach to communicating college readiness expectations is through setting academic content standards, used by 20 of the 33 states with college readiness definitions. 33 states have defined what it means to be ready for work. That's 3 additional states from 1 year ago and 12 additional states from 2007 when we started tracking this indicator. One of the most fundamental ways that states can influence patterns and rates of graduation is by setting requirements for earning a diploma. Typically, state policies in this area involve the culmination of formal course-taking requirements for standard diplomas and then pathways to allow students to earn an alternative high school credential. Course credit requirements have changed very little in recent years. For the average student in the class of 2011, earning a diploma requires accumulating a total of about 21 credits. Most often this includes 4 credits in English language arts, 3 each in math and science, and 2 or 3 in math or social studies, and 2 or 3 in science. 26 states offer some sort of advanced recognition for academic accomplishments that go over and beyond those required for a standard diploma or for a concentration in a particular career or technical program of study. For students not meeting standard diploma requirements, 29 states offer certificate of attendance or other alternative credential. Typically, these are options for students with disabilities or students who don't pass the high school exit exams. Speaking of high school exit exams, 24 states require students to pass them to qualify for a standard diploma. That's one fewer state than last year at this time. English, language arts, and math are the most commonly tested subjects, with 22 states assessing students in both of these content areas. Testing programs in 10 of these states also cover science and social studies. 15 states finance remediation for students who fail exit exams, and all but 3 of the states that make passing an exit exam a formal condition of earning a standard diploma offers an appeals process or some alternative route to a diploma for at least some of the students who failed the test. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to some highlights from our annual review of how states are calculating graduation rates for NCLB. This graduation rate accountability data appears in our online-only state graduation briefs that accompany the release of Diplomas Count. This spring, we reviewed state accountability workbooks for NCLB and other information that's been posted on the U.S. Department of Education's website. We looked at the formulas that the states are using to calculate graduation rates for federal accountability purposes, the graduation targets set for adequate yearly progress, and the minimum annual improvements required for schools to make AYP if those targets haven't been met. There's been a lot of activity in graduation rate calculation across the states this past year. To a large degree, this has been spurred by the 2008 federal Title I regulations and also the peer reviews that went along with these regulations, requiring all states to report a 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate on school report cards for the 2010-2011 school year, and then to use that rate for AYP determinations in 2011-12. So we're coming very quickly to the point that the federal regulations will have some real teeth. We found that 25 states currently use a method known as the lever rate to calculate graduation rates for federal accountability. This is a method that tends to inflate rates by relying on undercounted dropout rates data. 23 states use what we know as a cohort rate, or the percent of students from an entering 9th grade cohort who graduate within 4 years. So over the past year, there was a federally supported peer review and approval process of states' targets and goals with respect to graduation rates. And this resulted in updated targets and goals across the states. Specifically, we found that graduation targets for the current AYP determinations now range from 63% to 90% across the states. In the average state, the target is 81%, which is up from 77% last year at this time. Final graduation goals in all states are now at least 80%. Georgia and Oklahoma have adopted goals for 100% of students to graduate. 19 states have a graduation goal of between 90 and 99%, and 29% have a goal of 80 to 89%. The final goal is 87% in the average state, up from 82% last year. At this time last year, 27 states were allowing their high schools to make AYP if they'd made any amount of improvement in their graduation rates. As a result of the rules established under the 2008 Title I regulations, this practice is no longer permitted. That low bar has now shifted upward a bit. This year, 25 states require schools to show an improvement of at least 2 percentage points in their graduation rates to make AYP. So overall, we see that almost half of the states are now using cohort rates for federal accountability purposes, and we also see a modest increase in the graduation rates high schools must achieve to make AYP. And those are the highlights of Diplomas Count 2011. Just want to turn your attention to a couple of things that you can find online. Chris has already mentioned the EdWeek maps, which provide graduation rates for all districts with high schools in the United States. We also have customized state graduation briefs, which go along with the release of Diplomas Count. Those are also customized for every state in the country and relay all of the data that you see in the hard copy of the report specific to each and every state. And then finally, you can find Education Counts, which is our big database that collects all of the indicators since we've been doing this over the past 15 or so years, including all of the data that we've just reported from Diplomas Count 2011. So with that, I will turn it back over to Debbie Villadero for questions and answers. Thanks.
good information in there. Any questions for our speakers? This gentleman over here.
I'm Hugh Walkup from the Department of Education. Could you talk about the difference between the different rates and specifically the rate that you used in the report compared to the cohort rate and what changes you might see in use of those rates?
Yeah, this is a question we get a lot about our methodology. And so we've been using the CPI method in Diplomas Count for all 6 years that's been published, and I actually started doing that a number of years kind of prior to coming to Education Week. One of the things that's distinctive about our rate, again, is kind of the ability to do a comprehensive national analysis. We're seeing a lot of progress on the state front because of the federal regulations and because of states' own initiative. And so about half the states are now reporting a cohort rate, and that's basically you've got a data system where you can track individual students over time. You can figure out who started 9th grade at a particular point in time. You can see what happened 4 years later. So about half of the states are doing that in a fairly robust way at this point, as far as we can tell. The data we use is from a federal database called the Common Core of Data, and that is a very comprehensive data set, but it's only kind of snapshot head count data from year to year, and so that's kind of what makes our data source distinct. About half the states are still using that kind of data themselves for their own graduation rates under NCLB. Our formula itself, one of the important things about it is it kind of breaks down the high school career from kind of going from 9th grade to 10th grade to 11th grade to 12th grade and getting a diploma. One of the things that we didn't see here is that allows us to kind of break down that graduation rate to figure out where exactly in the high school pipeline we're losing students. And the biggest source of student dropout is actually the 9th grade, which we've known for a while now, and it still continues to be the case. So, the method we use kind of has a lot of benefits. It's still really just about the only kind of independent source of kind of comprehensive information. But we are following the trends across the states very closely, especially related to the implementation of the regulations and the work that's going into data systems. And so as we come into the next year where all states presumably will be starting to report these kind of new cohort-based rates, we're going to be hoping to take a very close look at what the states are doing, because while the data system work is extremely important and the step to a cohort-based method can help a lot, it's not a silver bullet. And I think while we want to applaud the efforts that are going on, we also want to caution that we don't want to kind of wash our hands and assume everything is all fixed. Because whether you have kind of an aggregate level headcount data type of system or whether you can track individual students, there's a lot that goes on underneath the surface in terms of record keeping, in terms of verifying the status of students who are no longer within the purview of your system, whatever type of system that is. And although we haven't done a comprehensive analysis, we do periodically get a lot of questions about states who've kind of moved to a cohort rate, and we're asked to take a look at it by members of the press and others. And almost without exception, I would say there's something else that tends to happen when the states move to a cohort rate. It could be changes in administrative rules. It could be states deciding to count different types of high school credentials as a standard diploma, which is kind of how the graduation rates are defined these days. And so I think we want to keep on keeping a close look on these methods as they emerge, because there's a lot that goes on in terms of just the inner workings of the system. That's, I think, too often very much out of public view.
Another question right here.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Kenneth Ward with College Bound. We serve local youth. We graduate 100% of our kids from high school, and we just sent 100% of that class to college for this fall. Well, they've been accepted. So my question is about the lever rate here in the district that's being used. Amy, you made the comment that they inflate the graduation rate by not counting the dropouts. And I know that the dropout rate here in the district is one of the highest in the nation. So how exactly does that lever calculation work?
Yeah, it's a lever rate, and it's a formula for calculating the graduation rate. And in case folks don't know, there's all sorts of different ways you can calculate a graduation rate, and it's one of these things that 7, 8 years ago when we started to do this work, you figure graduation rate, That's easy. I'm kind of educational researcher. That's a simple thing to answer. It turns out it's fairly complicated, and one of the issues was before No Child Left Behind, very few states were doing kind of anything systematic on graduation rates. Some states were looking at dropout rates, which turns out is not quite the same thing. So there was a big learning curve, after No Child Left Behind came into effect. And so the lever rate was one of these methods that most of the large majority of states initially kind of latched onto. And if you look at this like a formula, I'm not going to kind of throw Greek around, but it's basically you've got on the numerator, you've got your graduates, and in the denominator, you're adding up the graduates plus 4 consecutive years of dropouts, 12th grade, 11th grade, 10th grade, 9th grade. And you kind of, kind of crank your calculator, and that spits out the lever rate. The thing that's an issue with the lever rate is when you kind of step back and look at all the letters and numbers, there's a lot of D's there. There's a lot of dropouts in that calculation. And the problem is that as we've learned, especially, but sometimes with, especially if you don't have a good student tracking system, and sometimes even if you do, states and districts tend to undercount their dropouts for a variety of reasons. It's hard to document dropouts. These are students who by definition are no longer around, and you need to figure out what happened to them. States and districts have different rules about what you do if you've got a quote-unquote status unknown student. Do you assume they're dropout? Do you assume they've transferred, and so forth? And so for all those kind of reasons, we have tended historically to undercount our dropouts. When you plug undercounted dropout numbers into something like a lever rate, you end up kind of inflating what the graduation rate is going to look like compared to other methods. And we've done our own analysis with kind of a comparable data and variety of different formulas for calculating the graduation rate. And kind of compared to our own method, we tend to find the lever rate is on average about 12 to 14 percentage points higher just on the basis of the formula and kind of the issues related to dropout rates. And so we see those, there's really a divide in terms of the different formulas that have been used. There's those that incorporate dropout information, which tend to give you quite high results, and those that do not use dropout information, like our own and a couple others, which tend to give you kind of more moderated numbers.
Over here. This one here.
My name is Marjorie Cohen, and I'm from the National League of Cities. Sort of on that topic, at least dropouts and actually dropout recovery. Are states getting credit for recovering dropouts in your calculation? Do they, or because it's a 4-year cohort rate, are they not getting that credit? And have you thought about expanding to the 5-year or the 6-year cohort rate?
Yeah, there's limitations with the Common Core of data in terms of what we're actually able to do. So we count everybody who gets a diploma kind of in the year they get the diploma. But this issue of kind of extended year rates and how dropout prevention programs or schools, alternative schools that serve, at-risk populations or students who are returning to school, that's a big issue, especially from a policy perspective, because it really does, it's really at the heart of a lot of kind of the kind of tough work and tough thinking about, so we've got No Child Left Behind, what's going to come next and how can we improve the type of system we have. And this is an important issue. I'm not sure anybody has kind of the perfect solution, but as you suggested, kind of the time frame, kind of extending, giving an extra year or two to kind of get credit for students, that's already been incorporated into the regulations in various ways. But I think we're kind of still looking forward, kind of reauthorization. Maybe it'll happen sometime, we'll see. And kind of what that'll mean for what kind of I personally think have been the really important advances we've made in terms of putting graduation on the map, even if it's not kind of on parity with test scores and some of the other things in the law. We've come a long way. 10 years ago, we would not have been talking about graduation rates at all. And so I think that is progress. But as we move along, it is important to kind of think about the broader array of educational settings and not to put too many disincentives in front of schools to kind of serve these, kind of challenging and difficult to educate students who've got a variety of things that are going on. I think we'll continue to look at that.
Over here, this fellow.
Congrats to the whole team on a fantastic job. When you take a look at the policy, how the policy changes are going out, either at the state level or the district level, and drill down a little bit further into those states and districts that really are moving in the right direction. What are you finding? What are the key variables that are
Yeah, so Neil was asking about kind of when we look at the state and district level, kind of what are we seeing as being the big drivers. I think there's no one thing. We've looked at this in various ways over the history of this particular report. And I think last year, we started to get at, kind of one of the issues that I've seen as being a common denominator in a lot of the districts that have been out in front of this. And, I'm a researcher, and so sure, he's going to say data is important and all of that. But, I think that's an important kind of strategy for districts because it enables them to really kind of tackle their programmatic work in a smarter and more targeted way. And one of the examples of things I think we've seen in a number of the districts that have kind of gotten national attention for kind of really tackling this issue is better understanding kind of who your student population who's at risk of not graduating is, right? And it's not a monolithic group. You've got students who are, kind of at, typical age and a couple credits shy or a lot of credits shy, and you've got, students who are, almost 21 and just need that one credit. And so there's quite a range, and depending on if you're that 21 credits, student with, 21-year-old student with one credit shy, or, you're a 17-year-old who's, failed half their classes, there's a much different type of intervention you're going to target at those particular students. And in districts like Philadelphia or New York or Chicago that I think have gotten a fair amount of national attention, they've really kind of done some triage and understand their population and have kind of learned from that and kind of targeted programs that meet the particular needs of those groups of students, and just kind of knowing kind of where the balance of your at-risk population is, I think is very important in terms of deploying resources and setting priorities for district. And so, I think there's any number of different strategies. There's dropout prevention strategies that have been successful in a number of places. National groups like America's Promise have kind of taken kind of a broader approach and convened summits of local communities that bring together kind of the education systems, the business leaders and community leaders to kind of tackle this issue from kind of all angles. And I think that's actually also an important perspective to bring to this issue, because especially when you get to the high school level. And dropping out is an educational problem, kind of poor preparation academically is one of the leading causes of dropping out, but so is kind of disengagement from schooling in a variety of different ways. And once you get to be a teenager, especially an older teenager, there's a lot of push and pull. Depending on your family or personal circumstances, there may be kind of a need or desire to work. And so, there's just things that kind of, kind of detract your attention from education. And the more we can kind of bring all the parties who've got a stake in this together, the kind of better view, we get more of a 360 view of the problem, and that also allows us to craft a more comprehensive solution.
I'd only add to that, I completely agree with everything that Chris just said. I think we're also seeing earlier tracking. It happens before high school, and what happens before high school can lead up to a series of escalating conditions.
Another question? I'll throw out one, if you don't mind. We saw the data there for the lower rates for males and black males in particular. What's the trend then for males of various racial and ethnic groups?
I think in general, over, say, the past 10 years, the trends in general have been higher. But especially for the African American males, I think, and kind of minority males, it hasn't been moving very much. They have not been improving as fast as some of the other groups. So we're not seeing a decrease of those kind of really large gaps to the extent that we would like to.
Questions? Caroline?
This is a very simple question. I may have missed this. It's 71.7% for the class of 2008. Oh, by the way, I'm Caroline Hendry. I'm Executive Director of the National Education Writers Association and an alumnus of Education Week. But I didn't see what the figure was for last year. It's 71.7, and I see that there are figures comparing it to, a decade before and the highest since the 1980s, but I didn't know what it was last year.
Yeah, last year nationally it was 68.8%. So that's a big increase on a national level. And when we see big increases like that, we're like, uh-oh, there's a problem with the data. But we look very closely, and the more we looked at the patterns, the more we're seeing that this is, really what appears to be kind of gathering momentum behind, these types of reform efforts. And so it's a big increase. We're confident it's real. We've seen it from other sources. The U.S. Department of Education does a calculation of their own. They've seen they saw a similar decrease the past couple of years, and then an increase for the same class that we're looking at now. And so it's a big increase, but it's real.
I believe we have time for just one or two more questions.
Following up on that, is that increase appearing to be driven in any way Sorry, is that increase appear to be driven geographically or in any other way by urban districts, or is it across the board nationally?
What we've seen kind of in the past few years at least is that we're getting more rapid increases in urban districts, on average. And so since they tend to have more students, that has a disproportionate weight kind of on the national number. So I think that's part of it. We're seeing kind of improvements at a more rapid pace there. But this is fairly broad-based, and that's one of the first things we looked at, whether there was, kind of clustering, and it is kind of all over the place. California, a big state, had a pretty large increase, and so that was a contributor on a national level. So I think as you go into it, you can kind of find kind of nuances and sub-stories here. But I think the urban piece, in the past few years, we've been seeing that kind of that's part of the nascent upward trend.
One last question. Okay. Thank you very much.